Hello and welcome to the next episode of Let's Talk Brand, the first in Poland series of video interviews with world-class branding experts. Today I'm excited and honored to interview Rob Meyerson, who is brand strategist and namer, whose clients range from startups to the Fortune 500. Rob's work is international in scope. Rob has written about branding and naming for Entrepreneur, Business Insider, The Guardian, and TechCrunch. He also hosts a podcast, How Brands Are Built. He's an author of Brand Naming, the complete guide to creating a name for your company, product, or service. According to the testimonial from Denis Lyon, this is the Bible for the brand namers. I hope you will enjoy listening to my conversation with Rob Meyerson. Hello, welcome to the podcast and welcome to Poland, Rob.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Have you ever been in Poland?
I haven't. I have not been. I would love to go. Are you in Warsaw?
No, in Gdańsk. This is north coast of Poland.
Okay. I would love to take a trip, but haven't been traveling all that much lately for obvious reasons.
All right. So maybe in the future we'll meet here in Poland.
I would love it.
And I would like to talk with you about brand naming. But I would like to start with the questions: why and when you became obsessed with naming, or maybe not obsessed, focused on brand naming?
Yeah, it started right at the beginning of my branding career. I, like a lot of people in branding, I think I sort of fell into the industry. I started at Interbrand in San Francisco, but I was just helping somebody working on the new business team. So I was helping write proposals and put together presentations for pitches. I didn't really know anything about branding. I had just been hired because I could write, and luckily somebody needed help. But the head of naming in that office needed help on a project, and he asked everyone in the whole office, there were about 20 or 30 of us, to just come up with ideas. And I had never heard of naming before. I didn't know it was a job or something that people did professionally. But I helped out, and I just really, really enjoyed it. And from then on, took any opportunity. I actually sought out opportunities to, at first, just come up with name ideas, which is, as we can get into, just a small part of the actual naming job. But that's where I really started to fall in love with it.
Right. And that's what you do now in your company.
It's part of what I do. Yeah. So I'm a brand strategist. I do all kinds of brand consulting, brand strategy work, brand architecture, and naming, other kinds of verbal identity work, so messaging and brand voice. And then I run my own small agency, so we can do visual identity design, logo design. I don't do that myself, but I'll hire freelancers or contractors to help out with that and bring a team together for projects for clients.
Okay. I think maybe it's worth to explain what is actually brand naming or how brand naming works.
Sure. So brand naming can be naming a company or a product or a service. And you might think that names are easy and you just call it whatever you want, but it's quite difficult for a number of reasons. One of maybe the most obvious reasons is legal availability. So it turns out that the first name that comes to mind for your company is probably already being used by somebody else in a similar type of company. And so it's different in different parts of the world, but generally speaking, you can't just use a name that somebody else is using because they could sue you, or the local trademark office could reject your application to use that name. And so you have to find something that's available. Beyond that, you also want to take advantage of this opportunity to give your company or your product a name that is going to be memorable, that maybe tells people a little bit about what the brand is, what they might like about it, why they might want to buy it, or why they might want to hire you or your company. And so figuring out the right name and then finding the right name that's actually available is also part of the process. And so it can be somewhat of a rigorous process of coming up with hundreds of ideas and then whittling that long list down to the best option for the brand.
Okay. Is it possible to check? How can we check fast this legal availability of names?
Sure. It also depends a little bit on where you are, but in the US, I'll speak to the US since that's where I am. And then a lot of this is similar in other parts of the world, but just using different entities. So in the US, we have a United States Patent and Trademark Office, and they have a free and publicly available database that you can search on. It's a little bit difficult. It's a government database, so it's a little clunky. You have to know how to use it. It's not as simple as Google, but you can search to see who else is using what kinds of names. You need to limit your search to the types of goods and services that you'll be selling under that name. So trademarks are specific to goods and services. That's why we have many brands that do have the same name, but they're in different markets. So famous ones are Dove chocolate and Dove soap. Finlandia it has multiple products, but not just vodka, but also I think cheese. And so you can limit your search to specific industries and see who else is using it. You can also do Google searches just to see if there are other companies or products out there with the same name. And so there are a number of steps that you could go through. Ultimately, to do it yourself, you can only do kind of a simple check to make sure there aren't obvious problems with the name. Before you actually launch a brand, if it's something that you're really going to invest time and money in, you should ask a trademark attorney for a professional opinion of whether or not that name is okay to use.
Okay. What does it mean? Okay. I'll come back to this a little bit later, but when should we think about the name? Because I think it's very tempting for entrepreneurs to start with the name and the logo. In a way, it's understandable for me because it means that the decision to start a business is already made. We have the name, we have to name it. But I guess we shouldn't start with the name.
Well, not quite. Yeah, I think the way I like to think of it is you should do some strategy work first, then the name, and then the logo or visual identity. So it comes in between those two things. The strategy work can mean a lot. Strategy can mean a lot of different things, and it really depends on what you're doing. But what I mean by it in this case is that before you start coming up with name ideas, you should put some real thought into what is it that you're building? Why are you creating this brand? Who is it for? And who is the competition? So you don't want the name to just be the first thing that popped into your head because, like I said before, maybe somebody else is already using that. But also you may just be missing an opportunity to stand out from the competition. So strategy is partly just knowing your competition and making sure that you're standing apart from them in some way. It's also knowing your customer. So it could be that a name that you think is great doesn't actually make a lot of sense to the people that you're selling to. If those people are very different from you, if you're creating a brand for teenagers and you're in your 30s or 40s, then maybe you should do a little research on what teenagers are going to think sounds good or sounds cool instead of just coming up with what you think sounds cool. So that all of that is strategy. And so that can be done very formally through a process with a consultant or by yourself. There are lots of tools and models and frameworks that you can use, or it can be relatively informal. You can just talk to your co-founders or friends and family and just do the bare minimum work to make sure that what you're coming up with for your brand makes sense in that context.
Mm-hmm. But I always think about these entrepreneurs who cannot afford to pay Rob Meyerson or any other expert for this kind of professional advice. And and I'm always looking for some easy steps we can take to find the right name, to find the right visuals, the right messaging for our company. So what questions should we answer before we start creating, inventing a name?
Yeah, what I think you should do is put together what I call a naming brief. And if you're familiar with creative briefs from logo design or the advertising world, it's basically the same thing. And I have a free template available. It's in the book that I've written, but it's also available for free on my website. And it lists the questions, but some of them I've already mentioned. So who is the audience? What do they like, dislike, care about? What are the competitor names? And if you can see any kind of trend in the competitor names, then you'll want to call that out. Just what is it that we're naming? The most basic question. You can also think about different types of names. So one thing we haven't talked about yet is there are many different kinds of brand names. There are what we call descriptive names that tell you exactly what the company does or what the product is. Then, of course, we're all familiar with these very abstract names like Apple for a computer company doesn't tell you anything about what that company does. There are real words like Apple. That's a real English word, of course. But then there are completely invented or coined words like Dasani, the bottled water company, or Exxon or Kodak. These are all just made up words. And so it can be useful to think a little bit in advance what types of names make the most sense strategically, or it can maybe just be your preference if you're starting your own company. Do you hate some kinds of names and just not want to do that? It can also come down again to the competition. If everybody else has one type of name, maybe you want to consider something else so that you'll stand out. So those are some of the initial questions that you'll want to answer. And I think it makes sense to write them down, write down your answers so that you can refer back to that as you're coming up with ideas. Also, if you're working with anybody else, even if it's co-founders, then you want to make sure that you all agree on these things before you spend a lot of time coming up with ideas.
Okay, but how to choose the right type of name?
Yeah, there is
the competitors, or this is a strategic decision?
It's partly strategic and partly taste. And there are pros and cons of these different types of names, but there isn't necessarily one type of name that's better than another in all situations. A lot of people, myself included, will recommend against a really descriptive company name that can sort of corner you a little bit in that it's hard to expand your business if you've really tightly described what you do. If you add a new product or a new service, it may start to make less sense. So Pizza Hut is a fun example of a restaurant that originally sold only pizza. Now they sell lots of other things. They've tried to rebrand so that people would know that you can go there for more than just pizza, but it hasn't really worked. And so maybe they wish they had come up with a name that wasn't so specific to just one kind of food. And so you might want to avoid that as well. Also, we usually recommend against an acronym for a company name. There are many brands like IBM that have been quite successful with an initialism for a name, but generally it's kind of a missed opportunity to have a name that means something immediately, or that is easy to say and rolls off the tongue. So there are some maybe right and wrong or kind of recommended ways to approach different types of names, but generally it really depends on the situation. A lot of it is looking at the competition and thinking about what you want your name to help you achieve.
Okay, but is there any easy process of finding the right name? Is it kind of a fun playing with words, brainstorming?
It can definitely be fun, but not necessarily easy. So once you have that naming brief that we talked about, the next step, as soon as that brief is approved by everyone involved, is to just come up with hundreds of ideas, and typically you need that many in order to find one that's available. And so that part can definitely be fun. There are a lot of different ways to do this, and no right or wrong way. It's partly just brainstorming. Start with ideas that are in your brief and think of synonyms, think of metaphors. This is the fun part that made me fall in love with naming right at the beginning, is just playing with language, thinking about the etymology of words, thinking about ancient languages or foreign languages and how do they convey these ideas. Just really interesting ways of conveying ideas, but also thinking about the way words sound. Are they fun to say? Are they easy to say? Do they rhyme? Do they have alliteration? All of this can contribute to a really great name. And so spending a fair amount of time coming up with lots and lots of ideas is the next step, and one of the most fun steps. After that, it gets a little less fun because you start finding out that often many of your favorite ideas are not available or sometimes suffer from some other problem. In fact, I'll say that a lot of names that I've liked have caused issues for global clients who want to do business in Poland. I don't speak Polish, but it seems as an English speaker that there are some letters, some consonant clusters in English that just do not work well in Polish. It's hard for Polish people to know how to pronounce them. And so sometimes you'll have a name that you think is great, but you realize that in Poland or in China or in some part of the world, people can't say it or it means something bad. And so you'll have to kill an idea for that reason too. So that part's less fun, although it can still be very interesting. If you're interested in language, I've learned more about language through doing naming work than I ever did studying linguistics in school.
So when you think you've got it, you have a wonderful name, then there's a problem with the legal availability.
Yeah.
Then there's a problem that
we call it linguistic.
Poland, it sounds strange,
yes.
Or it means something different.
Yeah. Or it can even
or there's no domain.
Yes, or there's no domain. Yeah, we can talk about that. Or it can just be that it's something I hadn't heard of in another country. It's not necessarily negative, but it could be a pop band in Poland that I'd never heard of. And that's not a bad thing, but it might just be strange to have a technology company with the same name as this very popular band in Poland. So all kinds of things like that can happen. It can be heartbreaking. Naming can really be frustrating. And that's part of why it is a job, I think, because people think it will be easy, and then they try to do it and find out how hard it is. And that's when they come hire someone like me or somebody else.
What do you think? Most of the B2B companies or entrepreneurs or CEOs in B2B companies, they think that it's not important. I mean, all this branding and all this visual communication and all this naming. So that's why there is a lot of strange names, because actually they don't care. Right.
Yeah. So is your question, why don't they care, or how do I convince them they should? I think there's an increasing realization that it is important, but it is hard to convince someone who really doesn't believe that it is. There are a lot of true stories of bad mistakes that have been made. And so that's one way of convincing people, that even if they don't think it's very important to get the right name, it's sometimes easier to convince people that it's very important to avoid the wrong name or the wrong logo or something like that. But really, a lot of this is just understanding human psychology, and that many things that we think are not important actually end up influencing our decisions quite heavily. Things like colors and sounds, things like jingles in advertisements can actually be extremely memorable. And it turns out that a lot of us don't choose the brands that we buy because of something specific that they said that resonated with us. It's often just because we remembered them when we went to the store. And so really understanding how humans process information and how they make decisions can be very powerful in understanding what will build a strong brand. And so sometimes part of our job as brand consultants or namers is just to teach and to help people understand that. And if you can't convince them, then you can't convince them. But I think a lot of people are starting to understand the importance of it.
It's really strange that something without the name actually doesn't exist for us, even if it physically exists.
Right.
We do things in the name of the king, of the queen, of the Caesar, of the Pope, of the God. And we call the names, so we need the names so something exists physically.
Yes, well, that's right, and that's a great argument for the importance of it. There's a quote right at the beginning of my book that the second you give something a name, you've changed the way people perceive it. And of course, there's the famous quote from Shakespeare, "A rose by any other name," which it seems like is saying that the name doesn't matter. But of course, the whole point of Romeo and Juliet is how important names are, because people in the play literally die because of their last names. So the idea that what we call something can change how we perceive it is there's hard science behind it, but also I think we can understand it in our day-to-day lives.
But okay, what about the companies that have been on the market for a long time but actually do not have the best name?
Sure.
Should they think about the change or when it's time to change the name?
Yeah, well, we've seen some big name changes recently, right? We saw Facebook change to Meta at the corporate level, and we've seen some brands, especially in the US, we've seen some brands rebrand because of cultural or racial insensitivity in their names. I think that the default position of most brand strategists is to not change things unless you have to. There's more and more evidence that consistency is one of the most important factors in building a strong brand. And so you don't want to change your logo or your color palette or your name just because you're tired of it or you feel like it's outdated even necessarily. You should try to avoid that reaction, that sort of too quick reaction to change something. But there are times when change is important. I think one of those is when you recognize that there's something really problematic with your name, like it being racist or some other way culturally insensitive. Sometimes mergers and acquisitions require name changes for legal reasons. Sometimes other legal issues will result in needing to change the name. And so there are a number of very serious tangible reasons that you might need to change the name. And in those cases, yes, I think it makes sense to do so. But it has to be a pretty significant reason.
Okay. What actually makes a good and a bad brand name? Is there any recipe for success or a failure on the other side? Or good name, or does the good name helps company grow?
So yeah, a couple of things. I mean, a great name is not going to guarantee success, right? I mean, if you have a terrible product or company, then it can't save you. And I'd say the opposite is true. A lot of companies have succeeded, as you just pointed out, probably in spite of not great names. I mean, I would argue even that Google is a pretty silly name. I mean, it's memorable and it stood out against competition, so it had that. But I don't know that any of us 20 years ago would have said it was a brilliant brand name. It sounded ridiculous, and yet here we are with it being one of the greatest brands or businesses on earth. But I do think there are some things that can make some brand names stronger than others. It depends again on the context, but you want to make sure your name is strategically sound. So you want it to be memorable. You want it to be adaptable so it doesn't trap you, like the Pizza Hut example I gave before. Distinctive, so standing apart from competition. There are some creative factors that are a little harder to describe, right? Because it's a little more subjective. But does it sound good? Does it have some emotional resonance to it? Can also be quite important. Even the length of it. So all things considered, shorter is probably better. And then there are just those technical issues that I talked about earlier, the legal availability, linguistic issues, avoiding those, making sure it's pronounceable in whatever languages or cultures you want to do business in. So there isn't a list of things that every name has to check off, but those are the different areas that you should consider when you're weighing whether or not a name is good. And then there are some things that can, I think, make names bad besides everything I just listed. So you want to avoid trends. Right now, there are a lot of startups with names that end in ly. There's Bitly and Namely and Optimizely and all these kind of silly names. So avoiding that, I think, will make your name stand the test of time. Trying not to shove too many meanings or ideas into one short name. These are other things that can make otherwise decent name ideas start to look less good over time.
All right. How about name generators? I would never use a logo generator, but
yeah,
when I play with words, I really wonder why not to use a name generator that helps us to find something that sounds cool, or I would never find anyway. So
sure.
What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think it's fine to do that. In that name generation phase, I really have the position of the more ideas, the better, pretty much. I've used crowdsourcing tools for clients in addition to my professional namers that I work with who come up with hundreds of ideas on their own. I will say that generally I find that fewer people with more expertise and more time is better than lots of people with very little expertise, each spending half an hour, just coming up with their first 20 ideas. You'll find that the first 20 ideas anyone has, no matter how brilliant they are probably not going to be great. It's really once they've spent a few hours digging into the challenge that they start to find some really more interesting ideas. And so I have no issue with people using any kind of whether it's an online crowdsourcing tool or even an AI or something like that. I just wouldn't necessarily expect that to solve the problem for you on its own, but it can certainly be a good addition to whatever else you're doing, trying to come up with.
Right. Can inspire you.
Absolutely. And it, AI especially can just come up with things that humans might not. And a lot of those are terrible, but it doesn't matter because one or two of them might be good enough that it could become the name. And ultimately you only need one. So even if the other 99% are bad, it doesn't matter at the end.
How much time it takes to find the right name? I know it's very general. It depends, I know.
Yes. No, so I mean, a naming project, usually we try to spend about 5 or 6 weeks coming up with the name idea. And that's starting with making that naming brief, getting it approved. It takes time to go through those legal steps. So that's a relatively long process just from the very beginning to the very end. Actually coming up with name ideas, I like to say that 4 hours of brainstorming is a minimum, I think, for one person trying to come up with ideas. It doesn't necessarily have to be 4 hours all at once, but spending time over a couple of days or weeks even, thinking about it, looking things up online, doing research, is really what you need. And generally you want more than one person doing that simultaneously and compiling all of those ideas into one single list.
Okay, so quite a long process.
It can be, yes, yeah.
It can be. Okay, of course, it all depends on how big the company is or what the market is going to be. It's going to be international or the local company, of course. I understand. Rob, thank you for sharing your knowledge with Polish entrepreneurs, marketers, and students as well. Also through your book. I really enjoyed it. It's super easy to read.
Good.
It's really game changing, and I love it absolutely. And I hope it's going to be on the bookshelves here in Poland.
I hope so too.
It was a pleasure to have you here, and actually, thank you for being a part of my Polish branding revolution.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much.